Well, the program to date has been great, and I certainly am blessed for having been here. I don't want to thank Mervil for dying to allow me to be here, but everyone has been wonderful. As I got this assignment from Mervil to speak at his funeral, the first thing I thought about is, why in the world do we have funerals? I don't know about you, but I don't like going to funerals. I always try to find some reason that I'm too busy or there's too much going on, because I like to just remember people the way they were. And so my first thought was, well, why are we having funerals? And if you think back about it, even the people that we didn't know much about, who lived a long time ago, whose remains we find, we know that there's been this burning desire within human beings to celebrate life, once it ends. And I think it must be a very primitive need that we have within us, or perhaps a divine need that we have within us, to remember why we're here and to take that opportunity to maybe be better people because of having, celebrated the life of someone who's no longer with us. My next thought was, well, what can I say? Everyone before me will talk about their experiences with Mervil. The thought I had as I looked at the pictures was that you could probably build 10 American cars today out of the fender of one of those cars. I guess the biggest memory I have immediately of Mervil is, again, his grin. And whenever something would happen with somebody who was related, he would always say, but they're family. And the relationships are very complicated, I think, that occur in every family, but certainly in this family as well. We love our relatives, we hate our relatives, we can't stand our relatives, we can't do without our relatives. And so I thought I'd spend a little bit of time talking maybe about families, and I do that with great humility because there are many people in the audience who have a lot of credentials greater than mine about interpersonal relationships and families. But the question, I guess, as Mervil would say, their family, would be, what did family really mean to Mervil, and what does it mean to each of us? Are families, even important today when the government really takes care of everybody? I mean, who needs a family after all? Well, how would Mervil have answered those questions if he were here today? He certainly, as we know, didn't have a wonderful family that he grew up in. But he had a vision, I think, of what he wanted a family to be like, as each of us have had. And each of us try our best to make our family maybe better than the family we grew up in. To take the good that we had and try to improve on the bad. And certainly Mervil tried to do that. Was he perfect? Of course not, because none of us are. But do we need a family after all? Well, of course. And that's one of the problems, I think, that we have in the world today as well as in our neighborhoods. And I spent lots of time, I guess, feeling somewhat guilty that I didn't spend more time, doing things for Mervil. But we live in very busy times. Life is very complicated. We sometimes sort of go from crisis to crisis and can, beat ourselves up all day long feeling guilty about the things we didn't do. But then I realized that Mervil was able to create families every place he went. So if his children weren't here, it didn't make a whole lot of difference because he would go adopt somebody. It might be a renter, it might be someone, again, at a restaurant, but it might just be someone who looked like they needed a friend wherever he went. Now, I think Mervil and Glenn probably hired every member of the family who was capable of doing anything at some time in their life. I certainly learned a lot about working, and I had the advantage of not being a child, because I think he knew that if he didn't treat me right, I would tell my mother, who would come to beat him up. Because Mervil was probably never good enough for Peggy in the sight of my mom. And so I was treated very well. I remember passing out flyers door to door when we'd have sales at the Bandelier Market. I mean, today nobody would even think about hiring, you know, a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old, much less sending them door to door. But, you know, my aunt would park at the end of the block, and, you know, we'd hit both sides of the street, putting flyers in the doors, and then get back in the car and go to the next block. I remember Mervil sending us, when the grocery store wars were at their peak, with Piggly Wiggly and Safeway and other places, you know, trying to put everybody out of business. Mervil would send Aunt Peggy and Terry and I, you know, to the competing stores to buy their lost leaders, which, you know, the sugar that was, you know, 10 cents a bag, or the flour that was 10 cents a bag, or the cooking oil, or the Crisco. We'd take it back and then remark it and restamp it, because we couldn't buy it as cheap as they were selling it, and managed to survive. I think, you know, my used car salesman personality came a lot from Mervil. I never quite fit in the medical community because I was too entrepreneurial. I was always trying to find ways to not be a generic doctor, and it drove my early partners crazy, and therefore they became non-partners fairly quickly. But I was always looking for a way to provide a better service, which is what, again, Mervil taught me. His work ethic was incredible. And I learned that from my father too, but my father was just never around because of his work schedule. You know, my dad had weekdays off when I was in school, and I spent more time probably with Mervil working at the grocery stores, spraying down the lettuce or facing up the cans or doing those terrible inventories. I mean, if you've never done inventory in a grocery store, I mean, we would all fight to stay out of the hardware section. Counting screws and nuts and bolts when they were in bulk, and was pretty incredible. But I did get to stay up late on those nights because we'd start about 10 o'clock at night and, you know, work all the way through the night. And you got to eat whatever Mervil would allow you to eat during those inventory sessions, so it wasn't all bad. But when we think of the Hannas and the Pollocks, which were really the roots of Mervil and Peggy, we think of two strong families. And they were who you always turned to if you had something that you needed. You know, they were always ready to help if you called. And if we can preserve those feelings and those loyalties in, you know, Mervil's children and grandchildren, that's going to be nothing but a plus for the future. Then we have the Olson family, which makes things somewhat schizophrenic, with that married relationship to the Hannas, but not a blood relationship. But they belonged just as much. It would be great if life was black and white, but we live in New Mexico. And not a lot that's black and white. There's lots of shades of gray. You know, that's what we grow up with here in New Mexico. We believe in gray and tan and the rich browns. Granted, there's not a whole lot of green, but we sort of traded it off for the blue that we find in the sky. And we all seem to have a little bit of sand in our veins. And that's good. Again, Mervil had lots of families. And I guess I learned a lot from him about loyalty, which comes in families. You know, again, despite the good times and the bad times, I swear Mervil would go to the mat for any of his kids, or, you know, stepsons, or cousins, or nieces or nephews. And I was always amazed that he seemed to be the richest man that I knew. I'm sure he didn't seem rich to his family, but I could hardly wait on Christmas mornings to go to their house because they got all the good stuff. And they had a TV in their bedroom. Who ever heard of that? And then they drove around in a Cadillac. I mean, while we were driving around in Chevys, and the big deal was when we bought a Volkswagen. So I learned about loyalty from him. And, his families, be the merchant marines who were not always kind to him, or store employees who may have stolen from him, neighbors, who weren't always kind, and his wife and his children, who, like all wives and children, weren't always perfect either. But he was always loyal if it came to any question. Frequently demanding, I think that can be said. And that's where I learned how to work and how you really did turn the label just the right way on the cans when you faced up, and how you could comb through the lettuce and make sure that you weren't wasting money, but you also were getting rid of the part that people shouldn't have to buy when they bought it and it was being weighed. So he fought the big boxes. He wanted government just to leave him alone. It wasn't always fair what government did to you and regulations did to you. He certainly was a self-starter, an entrepreneur, wanted more for himself as well as his family. And even though I saw him as being very lonely in the last decades of his life, being here quote-unquote alone, he never was alone in reality. He did take from the government in the end, but he earned everything he got and wouldn't have taken it had he not earned it. And I respect him for that. So my counsel to you as I close from Mervil is to keep those family ties strong. Look for the positives and not the negatives. Love each other regardless of water under the bridge. We can't change what happened yesterday, or 10 years ago, or even 50 years ago. Yet sometimes those little pieces of sand can cause blisters if we don't get them out of our shoes. And those blisters then, ruin a hike, ruin a trail, ruin a trip, ruin a lifetime. So I'm grateful to Mervil Hanna. I'm glad that he had a chance to meet Peggy, and that I'm part of that extended family that runs all the way from Preston, Idaho to Kentucky to now all over the place. If I could wave a magic wand, I would have us all living together again. But the world just isn't that way. You have to kind of live where you can make a living. Besides, it's hard to live with extended families. It's sometimes easier to not live among your family members. Then they don't know what you're doing, you don't know what they're doing, and most of all, they can't give you any advice. So thanks, Mervil. We appreciate having an opportunity to be here today and to continue that tradition of mankind of looking back while looking forward. And we all are very, very much blessed by having known you, whether you were our father or a friend. And I say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.